You're listening to Journey Back, the podcast about past life regressions, ghosts, and much more with your host, Cliff Aguirre.
Today on this Journey Back podcast, I have a special guest, Jim Harold from the Paranormal podcast. And Jim will be talking about his own experiences with the paranormal and much more. So I'd like to welcome Jim Harold.
It's a pleasure to be here, Cliff. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I've always enjoyed speaking with you on my program, so it's a real honor to turn the tables here and speak with you and your audience. So thank you. Thank you for the invite, and glad to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. I'd like to start by asking, what was it that first got you interested in the paranormal?
Well, that goes back probably about 40 years. There used to be a television show called In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy.
I remember
and
that.
So many people my age, I'm middle age there. So many people my age say, that's what got me interested too. And I just thought it was great that there were all of these questions out there. And that there was so much, even at a young age, I felt science is great. I think it's fantastic, but I still think there's an unseen realm. And to dive into those questions and explore them, well, it's been a kind of a lifelong obsession. And way before podcasting was ever invented, anytime I would go into a library or a bookstore when they still had those, I would gravitate right towards the unexplained mysteries section. And it really has been a lifelong fascination. But I guess I have to tip my cap, literally here, to Mr. Nimoy, because that's what got me started in all of this many, many years ago, back in the 1970s. Of course, I was very, very young.
Of course. What brought you to creating your own podcast?
Well, I had gone to school for broadcasting, and I ended up working in the business. I graduated in the early 90s, but I ended up working at a radio station and ended up in sales of all things. And I'd been doing that in various capacities for various stations, and even went into some print advertising for a while when that was still a viable thing. And I was working at a radio station in 2005, and I kind of looked up and I said, well, the whole dream of broadcasting, of being in front of the camera or in front of the mic, that's kind of dead, because now I've got responsibilities. I've got a family, a wife and 2 kids, a mortgage, all that good stuff. And I heard about this thing called podcasting, and I said, well, maybe I might not make a living at it, but it's something that I can do for fun to kind of scratch my broadcasting itch. And I thought about, well, what topics would I be interested in? And like most people, I have many things I'm interested in. And the one that I kept coming back to, and at the time there weren't a lot of podcasts dedicated, heck, there weren't a lot of podcasts dedicated to anything back in 2005. I said, I'm going to do one on the paranormal. I'm going to do the show that I would like to hear. And did it on the side for a few years, and lo and behold, it started to build a listenership. And I started to look at it and say, well, I'm making this much money at doing podcasting and that much of my full-time job. If I just got rid of this full-time job, I bet I could do better than what I'm doing with both combined now. And it turned out that way. In fact, in a few days, here June 25th, I think I'll be celebrating my sixth year of full-time podcasting. So I'm very grateful that I have this opportunity to share my passion for these subjects with a great audience. It's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy it.
I was interested in knowing if you had any paranormal experiences yourself.
Well, I kind of joke that I'm about as sensitive as a piece of wood. I have had a couple of experiences that are more under the kind of categorization of after-death communication. So I'll give you an example. My brother was 2 years younger than me, and unfortunately, he passed in 1999. He was autistic. And my brother loved music, and he loved all sorts of music. He loved everything from rhythm and blues, soul. He used to love Soul Train when that show was on TV back in the 70s and 80s. He loved classic country music. That's what my family was from the Upper South, so we grew up with that. But he also loved, of all things, Lawrence Welk. And this will come into this story. So anyway, he had passed, and my wife and I'm in Ohio. I'm in the Cleveland area, and we'd driven down to West Virginia where my parents lived to go to the funeral. And we were coming back, and we were flipping on the radio stations, and we came across one of those stations. They used to, I don't think they call it this anymore, but they used to call it the music of your life. And it was things like Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole and all that. And I always loved that kind of music. Like my brother, I like a lot of different kinds of music. And I heard this instrumental come on all of a sudden. I'm like, that's vaguely familiar. Who is that? And then the DJ came on the back announce. Of course, that was Lawrence Welk and his orchestra with his big 1960 hit, Calcutta. Now, I don't know about you, Cliff, but I can't remember the last time that I heard Lawrence Welk on the radio. In fact, that was the first time, and I think maybe the last time that I ever heard him on the radio.
I have never heard Lawrence Welk on the radio.
And to me, that was somehow my brother working with someone to arrange the cosmos in such a way that I would hear that song on the way back from his funeral. And to me, it was saying, don't worry, big brother, I'm okay, and here's a song for you. I really do believe that.
My father was a music producer in Los Angeles. Passed away also. And I was driving down the street. I was playing CDs in my car at that time. And I heard this voice in my head that said, turn on the radio. There's something you're going to like. And I turned on the radio to the local station, and my father's song was playing on the radio.
That's awesome.
I can relate to what you're talking about.
That's fantastic. I had another story, if you want to hear it, which is kind of similar. It doesn't involve music, but it does involve something kind of very serendipitous. Last November, I was privileged to be on a paranormal-themed cruise with Rosemary Ellen Guiley, Micah Hanks, and we went down to the Bahamas, and we had some cruisers, and we did all the cruise things, go to the beach, all those fun things, but we also had some sessions like you would have at a conference when we had a day at sea. So they had a very nice boardroom, a conference room, and we were giving our various presentations. Rosemary gave one, I gave one, Micah gave one. So in between breaks, I had a little bit of a cold going, so I said, I'm going to take this opportunity and get some coffee. And we were walking. They had strategically placed the casino next to the conference room. I guess they figured that business people might drop some money as they're going to different parts of the ship. And I saw one of these, one of our cruisers, one of the attendees had signed up playing one of these claw machines. The claw goes down, and in this case, it would ostensibly give you the opportunity to pick up money. Well, the odd thing about that was, in 2013, my uncle died. Now, I was very close to my uncle. In fact, he was like my second dad. Now, my dad was present in everything for my growing up, but my uncle was the closest thing to being a dad who wasn't a dad. So I was lucky. I had two dads. So in many ways. So anyway, I kind of stopped in my tracks and thought, boy, I wish he were here right now, because he loved to play these claw machines. And he loved to play them in, stores that have the stuffed animals. He'd drop $10-15 to try to win, a 98-cent stuffed animal made in China. It was just the sport of it for him. He loved it. So anyway, that really impressed upon me as I was standing there. And within 10 seconds, a woman came up and stood next to the gentleman from our cruise, and she yelled out, "John, John." Guess what the name of my uncle was? His name was John.
How funny.
Yeah. And again, what are the chances? A very common name, of course, but I mean, I was really thinking on him. I was really focusing on him in that moment of time. I was thinking about him solely, how much I wish he had been there, how much kick he would have gotten out of that. Even if he just threw his money away just for the sport of it, he would have really enjoyed it. And just to have this woman yell out, "John, John," his name, how either a grand coincidence or, again, the cosmos aligning to give us a sign.
Definitely. Wow.
Those are my two stories, but nothing, no full body apparitions, no, nothing like that.
And I know that you also delve into UFOs. Do you believe in UFOs?
Well, yeah, I think there's certainly things in the sky we can't identify. I think that you have to, I think with most paranormal or supposed paranormal phenomena, I include UFOs in that. Some people don't. Some people think when you talk about the paranormal, you're just talking about ghosts. I tend to have a big tent philosophy. I kind of put UFOs into it. But I think there's definitely things in our skies that we don't understand. Now, does that mean every time somebody sees a light in the sky that they can't identify that it is? Sometimes people think UFO means alien. And I think it falls into several categories. I think many times people see a plane or they see a star and they think they're seeing a UFO. I think that's very possible. I think sometimes maybe they're seeing they're seeing military aircraft or experimental aircraft and don't realize it. These days, I think drones could be very common. But I think in many cases, you have two kinds of people. You have well-meaning people who are mistaken or hoaxers. But then I think there's another category, and that's where maybe we are talking about interstellar visitors. I think it's a small percentage, but I think there are some cases. I look at reports by people like pilots and things, something like the Phoenix Lights, which, you know, they tried to say it was flares, but the pictures I've seen of it, the video I've seen, that they don't look like flares to me. So I think there could be a good deal of military experimentation going, but I also think there may really be something to some of this. And I think it's entirely possible that we've been visited by aliens from another world or another dimension. But then again, that doesn't mean every time there's a light in the sky that somebody doesn't know what it is, that it's ET visiting, if that makes sense.
Have you ever had any personal experiences with a UFO?
Not really. I guess technically we saw a UFO maybe about 15, maybe 20 years ago. I'm not sure. My wife and I were traveling down a major thoroughfare here in the Cleveland area, and we saw what many people would call a green fireball. And the funny thing was, we had a local talk radio station on, and somebody called up and said, so-and-so, we're driving on so-and-so road, and we're seeing this green fireball. And the host was just like, what have you been drinking? And hung up on it. And it was like, good, we're not the only one who sees it. But I totally think that was space junk or something re-entering the atmosphere. I don't see that as an experience. But I will say, my dad and my mom had a tremendous experience that, if you don't mind, I'll share, which I think is really remarkable. It literally sounds like something out of a movie, and I totally believe them because my mom's passed, my dad's still alive. Very salt of the earth people, working class. My dad worked in a steel mill for 35 years, so not given to flights of fancy. But anyway, this would have been about probably 1970, 71. I was a baby or a very small child, and my parents had dropped me off at my grandma's. They were visiting. We lived up in the area in Ohio, but the family lived in West Virginia. So they were visiting West Virginia. I was with my grandma. They were out riding around, and I guess they were in this secluded, almost Lover's Lane kind of area. I don't want to know why, Cliff, but they were. Anyway, they were parked. My dad had this big 1968 Buick LeSabre, and he said they were parked there, and a light flashed. And he said it was so bright that he could, and you know, rural areas, they are dark. There's not a street light to be found. They are pitch black dark. He said that it lit up the sky so much, and it lasted for a while, that he could read the hands on the clock of the car when they used to have the old analog clocks. And then he said he looked to his left, and there was a man standing next to the car with what he called a welding mask, and said that the man had his hand up. Well, my dad said, well, that's enough. We're going to get out of here. And he peeled out and started going down the road. Now, here's what's interesting. The most interesting thing to me My mom and my dad both said that they saw birds with the largest wings they'd ever seen along the bank as they were driving out of this area. My mom said, that's the biggest bird I ever did see, Jimmy. And that made me think about things like if anybody's followed the work of Mike Cleland and owls and screen memories and those kind of things. So I wonder if, my parents had a really interesting kind of John Keel type experience. And we know West Virginia, it was a different part of West Virginia, but was associated with Mothman. So I've never had any really revolutionary UFO experience, but I would think that one of my parents was pretty wild. And maybe that's one of the reasons that I'm so interested in all this stuff. Plus another family story that I've been told. That maybe that not only Leonard Nimoy did it, but knowing that my loved ones, people I trusted and who didn't make stuff up, had these stories to share.
Well, that brings me on to the next question. I know that you have a following around the world, and how many listeners do you presently have?
It's very hard to quantify. If I had to guess, I would say all told about 100,000 is my best guess. It could be more, it could be a little less. And really, if you think about it, that's not that many people compared to the huge television shows or those kind of things. But these are people who enjoy the programs, and they've been very supportive, whether they listen to the shows, and that helps us with the advertisers, and they support our sponsors, or whether they're kind of the super fans who tune into our premium shows, and that helps us immensely, or they buy my books. I have a series of books based on my Campfire Show. So, again, I read somewhere that you have to have 1,000 true fans, raving fans, if you want to make a living. And I think we got a bit more than that. It's not, I'm not driving the Brinks truck down the road, but I'm making a living for me and my family, and I'm very grateful for it. I'm very blessed to have the opportunity to do something I enjoyed for a number of years. Like most people, I did things that I didn't always enjoy. There were elements to it I liked, but a lot of it I didn't like. And now I'm able to do this as an independent podcaster and media creator. And I get to set the policies for the company. And, when I was working in advertising for radio, if somebody came to you and wanted to advertise and you didn't feel that good about their business, you had to take their advertiser, or else you'd have to go looking for a job. You couldn't go to your manager and say, well, I don't want to advertise this bee pollen or whatever it is. They'd say, no, you take the advertising or there's the door. Now I have a company where I can practice what I like to call ethical capitalism. And I get to make the policies, and kind of the buck stops here, which I really enjoy.
And when you need a day off, I'm sure you can ask the boss, right?
Well, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, it's better than not, but it's also when the website goes down at 2:00 in the morning and your phone goes off, you're the one that has to deal with it. But all in all, yes, the flexibility of the schedule is great. I've got an elderly father. I'm able to help him in many ways that I couldn't if I had a regular 9-to-5 job. Although, Cliff, I do try to treat this like a 9-to-5 job, and a lot of times it's more than that, in that I come in here, I'm in my desk usually 8:30 in the morning, and I usually leave at a regular quitting time, plus doing things on the weekends and stuff. So I really do try to treat it very seriously, like I do have somebody, kind of watching over me, because I have to have that self-determination. I have to be driven, or else it won't be successful, and then I would have to go ask somebody else for a job.
Do your listeners ever share their stories?
Absolutely. That's what the Campfire Show is all about. And by the way, everybody can find the shows at jimharold.com, JIMHAROLD.com. And that show is exclusively made up of people's true stories of the supernatural. And I think that's my favorite show. And I think it's the favorite show that I do of all my listeners, of all my shows, for the audience. And essentially they just call up and say, we have Cliff on the line, and he had thus and so experience with his dad's song on the radio. Cliff, tell us what happened. And that's basically the show. It's great because, when I started, I just started because I was running low on some content on my main show. This was in 2009. So I need to fill a slot this week. So I thought, it'd be fun to do listener stories. And it was so well received. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm onto something here. And I'm like, well, what is it? It's like a campfire. And then it's like, aha, It's a campfire, Jim Harold's Campfire. So we've been doing it since 2009. I think there's somewhere around 350 episodes of that show. And we also have a great Facebook group for that. And folks can find it just by going to virtualcampfiregroup.com. It'll take them right to the Facebook group. And we really kind of watch that carefully. We have several administrators. And we do our best to make sure that we keep the spammers out. We keep everybody respectful. If somebody misbehaves, we boot them out of the group. And it's been a great thing. And we have over 17,000 members on that page as well.
Do you ever find any similarities in the stories that you hear?
Absolutely. I think that's really important because people will say, they'll call in and say, I thought nobody else had this happen to them, but here's what happened to me. And they will go on recounting something that shares many themes with other people. For example, one thing that keeps coming up that actually kind of shocks me is the question of doppelgangers. People seeing loved ones where they shouldn't be, seeing a father when they should be at work or those kind of things. And sometimes they tend to be associated with other strange kind of paranormal activity in the home or perceived paranormal activity. So that's one. Shadow people. A lot of people tell stories of seeing a dark, inky figure, darker than dark, almost like it's cut out of the universe. A lot of times wearing a hat, and that's very common. So we get a lot of this kind of repetition of the same themes and things that I didn't realize were as common as they evidently are. So that is true. And in a way, and I never claim to be any kind of guru or anything like that. I'm far from it. I'm just a guy that asks questions. But it does kind of form a paranormal support group of the year, not in the medical sense, but it does provide some confirmation that I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who experiences.
I have actually a story. One time when I was working at this job, I decided to take a break and went out my front door of the office and looked across the street, and there was a guy sitting in a car that looked exactly like I did. He looked at me, I looked at him, and our mouths just opened up like, oh my God, I'm standing across the street. It was the most bizarre feeling.
Right. And that's something I had, of course, heard of doppelgangers, but I thought it was the thing of fiction. But many people report that. Now, is that a ghost, or is that, science is looking more and more at the idea of parallel universes? Is the idea that maybe there's a cliff in another universe that was driving that car, and the two kind of like grooves in a record, it kind of skipped and you kind of crossed paths for a while? I don't know the answer. Again, and that's the thing. When I was a kid, we were talking about In Search Of. When I was a kid, what really annoyed me about that show, the one thing I didn't like is they never had an answer.
Right.
And the thing is when I started this out in 2005, I guess I was naive. I thought, this will be great. I'll talk to all these great people. I have all these great theories. I'll have this figured out within 6 months to a year. I'll have my answers I've been looking for. I got to tell you, Cliff, we're going on what? It's going to be 13 years this year that I've been doing these shows, 6 full time. And I'm no closer to any answers. I've got more questions than when I started.
Have you ever had a past life regression?
I have not. And I've always, that's one that I've always been very interested in, kind of on the fence one way or the other. And I think we had this discussion when we talked on my programs. One part of me says, boy, that makes all the sense in the world. And then part of me is like, well, no, it doesn't. I've always wondered about that, though, because it's interesting. Perfect example. You were commenting, I have a rotary phone on my desk here. You can't see it since it's an audio show. But I've always been drawn to old technology and history and those kind of things. Now, is that just an interest of mine, or is there some other reason that I am so fascinated by things of the past? On my left-hand shoulder, there's what they call a radio transcription disc from the old radio shows. It's not a record, but a radio transcription disc that they used to send around to the radio stations to play the shows before they had tape and satellite and all those things. So I've always been fascinated by old artifacts, old stuff. antique stuff. And I've always wondered, is that because I am the survivor of another era?
Well, if you're ever in the Boston area or I'm ever in your area, we should give that a try. And also on my podcast Journey Back, I'm going to be playing some actual recordings of people who went under past life regressions. So that'll be interesting for the listeners.
Yes, absolutely.
So after researching the paranormal, how would you summarize what you've discovered so far?
I think I'm more convinced than ever that there is some X factor out there. I kind of look at Plato's allegory of the cave, the idea of being chained to the side of a cave and there's a fire and we can only see the reflections of that fire, and we're kind of interpreting what's going on by looking at those reflections, and we build all these great theories and things. I think that might be what's going on here, that there definitely is something going on. There is something to some of this stuff. It's not all made up or hoaxes or anything like that, but it may be so mind-blowing and so far away from what we think it is that it's just that, it's mind-blowing. But I definitely think something's going on. Now, again, what it is, I couldn't tell you. Couldn't begin to tell you. Now, I'm approaching 50, so hopefully I've got a few more years to explore these questions. And I plan on doing that. And I hope someday we've got more answers. But until then, we're going to keep asking the question.
Well, the positive thing is that scientists are now actually saying that maybe there are parallel universes or realities. That's a plus.
Yeah, I think that I just interviewed Dr. Dean Radin, who is a honest-to-goodness scientist, worked for ATT, Bell Labs, worked for the government, and he seems to think so. He seems to think so, that there's something very odd going on. He's done some fascinating research, and he has a new book out called Real Magic. A real scientist saying there's such a thing as real magic. Imagine that. So I do believe that there are some scientists who are coming around to saying, hey, wait a minute. Because the example I always use, Cliff, is this. Is DNA, right? So DNA has obviously existed as long as humans have existed. But we didn't know that. And perhaps if you'd gone to a scientist in 1800 and said, well, there's the genome and these things are inherited and that's and something, they would have said, crazy. But it was there the whole time. We just didn't have the techniques, the technology, and the knowledge to understand it. And I think there may be things like that. So the things that are, quote, paranormal today may be the science of tomorrow.
I always wonder, what will my grandson be experiencing when he's my age, or in his 30s or whatever.
Amazing. It's amazing. I mean, we go back to the rotary phone. I grew up, I was a small child in the 70s. We had one phone in the house, and that was one like that was it. And now I hold this iPhone in my hand. It's not even the most up-to-date one. It's an iPhone 7 Plus, and it's got more computing power than they had to go to the moon. So, amazing.
I don't know if you ever heard the story about, and I can't remember, it was an actress. I can't remember which one it was. She went on a date with Steve Jobs one time. And he says, someday in the future, people will be holding phones in their hands, and they'll be able to get all their emails and everything. And she thought he was crazy. Well, we're doing it. Who knows what the future is? So do you want to talk any further about any of your books on Amazon, your Campfire series?
Well, I would recommend, if people want to see what it is that I do, the hub for everything I do is jimharold.com, JIMHAROLD. The two shows that I would direct them to if they're interested in the paranormal are the Paranormal Podcast and Jim Harold's Campfire. And each of those, you could get the last 90 days for free. We always have lots of free content up there to listen to. So I always encourage people to go for the free stuff first. Hey, if it's free, it's for me. And there's plenty of it there. There's hours and hours of content. And then if you really love what we do, you can explore it further in our Plus Club, but no need to even do that. Just go listen to the free stuff. Those shows can also be found on all the major podcast providers: iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, iHeartRadio. Basically, if there's an app that plays podcasts, we're in there. And the easiest way to find me is just look up Jim Harold. In terms of the books, we have 5 Campfire books. Those are basically compilations of the best stories from the Campfire podcast since 2009. You can get it in Kindle or paperback, but the easiest way to find that is we have a URL for that as well, just jimharoldbooks.com. That's jimharoldbooks.com, and that'll take you to the Amazon page with all of the various Campfire books. So that's my story, Cliff, and I really appreciate your time today and the opportunity to share these things with your audience. I hope they get to check everything out, and certainly continue to check this podcast out, because it sounds like you've got some great things in store for it.
So thank you for being my guest on Journey Back, and we'll be talking soon.
It's good. Thanks so much, Cliff.
That was my guest, Jim Harold of the Paranormal Podcast. Follow Jim's podcast to hear interesting stories about the paranormal and catch his Campfire series. Of course, follow my podcast, Journey Back, to hear all the upcoming shows. And I'll be presenting some shows where I'll be playing actual past life regressions for the volunteers for my book, Journey Back. And of course, you can buy my books on Amazon or go to cliffbooksmusic.com. So thank you for listening.